There was a time when people whispered that he was unraveling. Episodes of delusion surfaced, fueled by addiction, followed by brushes with the law and a frightening drift toward homelessness. Rehab came and went unsuccessfully, each attempt leaving him weaker, closer to collapse. It sounded like the familiar Hollywood tragedy, the kind attached to broken prodigies and public meltdowns. Listening to that story, you might assume we are talking about someone already written off. Then the image flips. Ron Howard has long been treated as the exception, the child star who survived, the polite, reliable presence who grew into a meticulous director. From The Andy Griffith Show to decades behind the camera, he represented stability in an industry addicted to chaos. Calm, controlled, untouched, or so it seemed, because beneath that immaculate surface, a quieter storm was always forming. A childhood lived under lights, expectations locked in place before identity had room to breathe, emotions learned to stay hidden, control became a shield, then a habit, then a necessity. For years, Ron carried these truths in silence, choosing precision over confession, craft over vulnerability. Everything changed the moment the news broke. Rob Reiner was gone. The loss was sudden, violent, and impossible to reconcile with the man's legacy. Prosecutors announced charges against his son, Nick Reiner, accused of killing both parents, Rob Reiner and Michael Singer Reiner. The industry froze, and so did Ron. For the first time in decades, the man known for composure was forced to confront something he could not manage, rewrite, or direct. What happens when the life you mastered offers no control at all? And if another person's tragedy becomes the mirror that exposes your own buried fears, do you look away, or finally look closer? This story begins at that exact breaking point now. Ron Howard was born into performance, but not into freedom. His parents, actor Rance Howard and actress Jean Spiegel Howard, did not push him toward fame for vanity. They believed in discipline, honesty, and preparation. Yet discipline, when imposed too early, becomes a cage. Before Ron could understand choice, his days were scheduled, his emotions regulated, his instincts shaped to fit a camera's frame. By the time The Andy Griffith Show premiered, childhood had already been replaced by responsibility. At 6 years old, Ron became Opie Taylor, America's symbol of innocence. Viewers saw warmth and simplicity. What they never saw was the quiet isolation of a boy completing homework in studio corners while laughter floated in from the outside world. Safety surrounded him, but spontaneity did not. That contrast formed the golden cage. Protected, admired, and profoundly lonely. Rance Howard tried to shield his son. He fought for better scripts, insisted on professionalism, and taught Ron a rule that would follow him forever. Never act cute, act honest. It was guidance rooted in love. It also taught Ron that mistakes were dangerous and exposure carried consequences. Control became the way to stay safe, not just on screen, but inside himself. That lesson resonates even more when placed beside Rob Reiner's world. Both men were shaped by strong parental influence, by fathers who valued craft and conviction. Yet, where Ron learned restraint, Reiner absorbed confrontation. Two childhoods, guided differently, produced opposite responses to the same pressure. One learned to speak carefully, the other learned to speak loudly. For Ron, the absence of a normal childhood did not disappear with age, it hardened into vigilance. He learned to anticipate problems before they appeared, to manage emotions before they spilled, to perfect behavior before it was questioned. Control was no longer a choice, it was survival. The golden cage had done its job. It kept him standing, admired, and intact. But it also quietly postponed something essential, the chance to live without permission. It was a childhood that looked ideal from the outside and felt constricting from within. Applause replaced play. Approval replaced exploration. And long before Ron could name the cost, he was already paying it, carrying order like armor, believing structure was love, and mistaking control for care. That confusion would echo through every success that followed, shaping triumphs, silences, and the fear of ever letting go in his life forever. By the time Ron Howard entered his teenage years, the world saw nothing but success. The cameras loved him. Audiences trusted him. He had already lived multiple lifetimes on screen before most kids his age had figured out who they were. When The Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, Ron was only 14, yet he had spent 8 years inside a carefully constructed version of reality. From the outside, it looked idyllic. From the inside, it felt incomplete. His education remained split between real classrooms and improvised lessons squeezed between takes. He studied algebra while crew members adjusted lights inches from his desk. Lunch breaks still belonged to adults, not peers. Andy Griffith, Don Knotts, and producers replaced classmates. They offered warmth and guidance, but they could not offer what Ron quietly missed, the freedom to be ordinary. As adolescence arrived, the gap widened. Teen years are meant for mistakes, rebellion, and discovery. Ron's were built around restraint and precision. Every movement was observed. Every choice felt permanent. He learned early that image mattered, that deviation carried risk. So he stayed careful. He stayed controlled. And slowly, that control began to erase parts of him. The pattern repeated with Happy Days. As Richie Cunningham, Ron became America's favorite boy, next door polite, dependable, frozen in nostalgia. But while the character remained unchanged, the real world was shifting. Protests filled the streets. The Vietnam War reshaped a generation. Ron felt the disconnect sharply. He asked the network for a single storyline acknowledging the war, something real, something honest. The request was denied without hesitation. That moment crystallized something painful. He realized he was living inside a version of himself designed for comfort, not truth. The audience adored the image. The industry protected it, but Ron felt increasingly invisible behind it. If the world loved a character that no longer reflected who he was becoming, where did that leave the person underneath? Here, the questions began to form quietly but persistently. If everyone applauds the version of you that isn't real, what happens to the rest of you? And when fame gives you everything except permission to grow, is that success or another kind of confinement? These years did not break Ron Howard. They trained him. They sharpened his discipline, his patience, his awareness of consequence. But they also planted a deeper hunger, the need to reclaim authorship over his own story. And that hunger would soon push him toward a decision that changed everything, stepping out of the frame and into control itself. The decision to step behind the camera did not come from ambition. It came from exhaustion. After years of being defined by roles written by others, Ron Howard felt a growing need to reclaim authorship over his own life. Acting had given him visibility, but directing promised something more dangerous and more seductive: control. The turning point arrived in 1977 when Roger Corman offered him a deal that few young actors would dare accept: star in a low-budget film, and in return, earn the right to direct. Ron agreed, not because the project was glamorous, but because it opened a door he had been staring at for years. Grand Theft Auto was made on a shoestring budget, co-written with his father, Rance Howard, and shot with reckless ingenuity. Cars were destroyed. Rules were bent. Creativity finally felt unsupervised. For the first time, Ron was not waiting for permission. He was making decisions about pacing, tone, risk. The camera no longer watched him. It obeyed him. That shift felt liberating, exhilarating, almost intoxicating. Directing gave Ron the illusion that he had escaped the cage that had followed him since childhood. But control carries its own gravity. With authorship came responsibility, and with responsibility came obsession. Every choice mattered. Every mistake felt personal. The same vigilance that once protected him as a child now resurfaced as perfectionism. Directing did not erase his need for control. It refined it. Still, the industry responded. Night Shift, Splash, Cocoon. Each success confirmed that Ron had found his place. Studios trusted him. Budgets grew. Expectations followed. What began as freedom slowly transformed into pressure quieter than fame, but heavier. Here, the paradox sharpened. Was directing Ron Howard's escape, or simply a new structure that allowed him to hide his fear behind mastery? When you finally control the story, do you become more honest or more afraid of losing control? And if freedom only exists inside carefully drawn boundaries, is it freedom at all? Ron did not have the answers yet. But one thing was clear. By stepping behind the camera, he had chosen a path where control felt like safety, a path that would define not only his career, but the cost he would pay for perfection in the years to come. Success arrived quickly, then relentlessly. Night Shift proved Ron Howard could command tone and timing. Splash confirmed he could balance heart and spectacle. Cocoon, Willow, Parenthood, each film expanded his reputation and tightened the industry's trust. Studios stopped questioning his choices. They relied on him, and reliance quietly turned into expectation. By the early 1990 seconds, Ron was no longer the former child actor who transitioned well. He was a guarantee, a director whose name calmed executives and reassured investors. With that status came a new, unspoken pressure: deliver excellence every time. There was no room for hesitation, no margin for failure. Control, once protective, became compulsory. Hollywood noticed something else too. Ron Howard and Rob Reiner were increasingly placed on the same invisible scale. Two filmmakers of the same generation, two sons of the industry, two storytellers drawn to family, morality, and the American conscience. Scripts circulated. Studios compared. Choices were weighed quietly. One was praised for precision and restraint, the other for boldness and confrontation. Different styles, same tier. Different temperaments, shared expectations. Then came Apollo 13. For Ron, it wasn't just another project, it was a test of authenticity. Accuracy became obsession. Sets were rebuilt with real NASA panels. Scenes were rehearsed endlessly. The crew endured hundreds of zero-gravity maneuvers to capture seconds of realism. Ron worked 18-hour days for months, driven by a singular belief: nothing could be compromised. The body eventually rebelled. Exhaustion and dehydration sent him collapsing on set. Production halted. When Ron returned, pale and shaken, the crew welcomed him with shirts reading Mission Control. It was meant as solidarity. It also revealed the truth he could no longer ignore. He had pushed himself beyond the edge. Here, the cost of perfection finally surfaced. How much brilliance is enough before it begins to consume the person creating it? And when Hollywood places two lives on the same scale, are they celebrating greatness or quietly fueling self-destruction? Apollo 13 became a triumph. Awards followed, praise poured in. But beneath the success, something shifted. Ron had proven he could control every variable except himself. The very discipline that built his legacy was now threatening to erode it. And in that realization, he began to sense what Rob Reiner, in his own louder way, had also faced. The fire that fuels greatness does not distinguish between creation and collapse. For Ron Howard, the most painful lessons did not come from a set or a studio note. They came from home. In 1991, his life looked flawless on paper. His career was soaring. His creative freedom had never been greater. And his family was growing. Jocelyn had just been born. Bryce Dallas Howard was still young. Stability, success, legacy, everything aligned. Then came the decision that would haunt him. A 6-month shoot for Far and Away in Ireland. Ron told himself it was temporary, manageable, worth it. Cheryl stayed home with their newborn twins and their children, holding everything together while he disappeared into production rewrites, weather delays, and relentless pressure. When Ron finally returned, the silence in the house spoke first. His daughter did not recognize him. That moment cut deeper than any critical failure. Bryce reacted with distance. Cheryl carried exhaustion that no apology could erase. Ron later admitted that standing in his own home, feeling like a stranger, shattered something fundamental inside him. The control that had defined his life had cost him presence. Years later, the pattern nearly repeated during the grueling reshoots for Cinderella Man. Long absences, endless decisions, sleepless nights. When he came home again, he realized his children had grown not just physically, but emotionally without him. That realization forced a reckoning Ron could no longer avoid. This is where his deepest fear surfaced, stripped of polish. Ron Howard was never afraid of failure. He feared being absent. He feared becoming a father who arrived too late, a brother who could not save, a friend who missed the final conversation. The fear was not public disgrace. It was private regret. In 2025, on the 50th anniversary of his marriage to Cheryl, Ron finally spoke that truth out loud. Standing at the high school where they first met, he admitted he would trade every award, every successful film, every accolade to reclaim the time he lost with his children. There was no audience applause, no cinematic framing, just honesty. Here, the question lingers quietly. What is more devastating? Failing in front of the world, or succeeding while the people you love learn to live without you? And when your own child no longer recognizes you, what does success even mean? This chapter reshaped everything. Ron began turning down projects that demanded prolonged absence. He stepped back from the nonstop pace that once defined him. Control was no longer about mastery. It became about boundaries, about choosing presence over perfection. The man who once believed discipline equaled love now understood its limits. Family exposed what Hollywood never could, that no amount of control can recover lost time. And once that truth is learned, it cannot be unlearned. Before Ron Howard learned what it meant to be a husband or a father, he learned what it meant to be a brother. Clint Howard was there for every strange milestone, two boys growing up on neighboring soundstages, earning paychecks before understanding identity, sharing a childhood defined by lights, cables, and adult expectations. To Ron, Clint was not a footnote or a curiosity. He was proof that someone else truly understood the weight of growing up watched. As adulthood arrived, their paths diverged. Ron's control hardened into mastery. Clint's sensitivity absorbed the pressure differently. By the late 1980 seconds, the gap between them had become frightening. Addiction and instability crept in quietly. Then all at once, Ron watched helplessly as the one person who had shared his childhood slipped toward destruction. In 1990, Ron did something that terrified him. He drew a line. Get help or lose me forever. It was not an act of authority. It was an act of desperation. For a man who had spent his life managing outcomes, this was the moment he surrendered control. Clint chose recovery, and it saved him. That experience reshaped Ron's understanding of love. Control could guide, protect, and structure, but it could not rescue another human being. Only choice could. Years later, in 2021, the brothers made their story public in the memoir, The Boys, acknowledging the honesty and boundaries that preserved their bond. It was not a victory lap, it was a reckoning. Long before that reckoning, Ron had already begun adjusting his life. In 1985, he co-founded Imagine Entertainment, not just as a business move, but as a structural decision. It allowed him to step away from 18-hour days and constant presence on set. For the first time, he was quietly choosing sustainability over total control, presence over dominance. Now, decades later, a new fear has entered Ron's life. Clint is facing a serious, life-altering health battle. The details remain private, but the impact is unmistakable. Hospital visits replace meetings. Waiting replaces directing. For the first time, Ron cannot plan his way through the crisis. This is where helplessness becomes undeniable. What happens when the person who fixes everything realizes there is nothing left to fix? And how do you live with loving someone when your only role is to stay, not save? Ron has admitted this fear has shaken him more deeply than any professional setback. It has slowed him, changed him. The discipline that once defined him now bends toward care, toward time, toward being present without solutions. In facing his brother's fragility, Ron Howard finally confronts the limit of control and the quiet strength of simply choosing to remain. The news did not arrive gently. It cut through the industry with a brutality no one was prepared for. Rob Reiner was gone. So was his wife, Michelle Singer Reiner. The details were violent, incomprehensible, and impossible to reconcile with the lives they had lived. For Hollywood, it was a shock. For Ron Howard, it was something deeper, a rupture. There are moments when language fails. Ron did not rush to statements or interviews. He did not offer analysis. He stopped. The man known for calm precision was suddenly still, confronted by a loss that could not be edited, reframed, or explained away. Silence filled the space where control used to live. No schedules, no solutions, No next steps. Just absence. Rob Reiner had always been a presence, loud, passionate, unapologetic. He spoke when others hesitated. He challenged when others compromised. And while Ron's way had always been quieter, the respect between them was real. They had grown inside the same system, fought for authenticity in different languages, and carried the same weight of expectation. Seeing Rob's story end in such violence shattered any illusion of order Ron still held. As the shock settled, grief took on layers. Ron was already living with fear for his brother Clint. Now loss arrived again, uninvited and uncontrollable. The timing felt cruel. It forced a realization Ron had spent decades avoiding. Some endings arrive without meaning, without warning, without permission. In private conversations, Ron spoke not of legacy, but of fragility. He reflected on how quickly lives shift, how easily plans dissolve. The tragedy did not make him louder. It made him more inward, more aware of how thin the line is between control and chaos. Here, the questions emerge quietly. Can a violent ending erase a lifetime of purpose and conviction? And when tragedy arrives without explanation, what power does control truly have? Rob Reiner's death did not just mark the loss of a filmmaker. For Ron Howard, it exposed the final truth he could no longer ignore, that no matter how carefully you build a life, some moments will always stand beyond your reach. And in those moments, all that remains is witness the act of standing still and acknowledging what cannot be fixed. From the outside, the relationship between Ron Howard and Rob Reiner looked simple. Mutual respect, professional admiration, polite exchanges at industry events. But beneath that surface lived something far more complicated, a quiet rivalry shaped by proximity, not hostility. They came up in the same system. Both sons of Hollywood, both directors trusted with stories about family, morality, and the American conscience. Studios often considered them in the same breath. Scripts passed between desks. Decisions were made in rooms neither of them entered. It was never declared, never aggressive, but it was real. Two lives placed on parallel tracks, measured against one another without consent. Their differences made the tension sharper. Rob Reiner believed in confrontation. He spoke loudly, challenged publicly, used his voice as a weapon. Ron Howard chose restraint. He told stories instead of speeches. He trusted subtext over declarations. Neither approach was wrong, but each reflected a different way of surviving the same pressure. Friends noticed the distance, conversations that stayed courteous but brief, smiles that never lingered, moments when one might have reached out but didn't, not from resentment, from timing, from assumption, from the belief that there would always be another chance. That chance never came. After Rob's death, Ron found himself replaying moments that once felt insignificant. A phone call postponed, a conversation redirected, a compliment never spoken. In a rare admission, Ron acknowledged what had always lived between them. "We didn't always see eye to eye," he said quietly, "but he made me better. Maybe I never told him that." Here, the questions linger uncomfortably. Does quiet competition sharpen greatness or delay connection until it's too late? And how many words remain unspoken simply because we assume time will wait? In the end, rivalry was never the story. Recognition was. Two men pushing toward the same truth in different languages, unaware that silence itself was shaping the distance between them. By the time Ron understood that truth fully, the conversation he needed was already gone. Today, Ron Howard moves through life at a different pace. The urgency that once defined him has softened. The endless call sheets, the 18-hour days, the obsession with getting everything exactly right, those no longer rule him. What remains is something quieter: time, presence, attention. After decades of shaping other people's stories, Ron has finally begun to sit with his own. Not as a performance, not as a confession, but as a recognition of limits. He understands now that control built his career, but it could not protect the moments that mattered most. It could not stop time from passing. It could not prevent absence from leaving scars. Rob Reiner's death did not give Ron answers. It gave him clarity. The same clarity his brother's illness forced upon him, the realization that some chapters cannot be rewritten and some endings arrive without meaning. Legacy, he has learned, is not measured in films completed or awards collected. It lives elsewhere. It lives in who is still beside you when the noise fades, in who recognizes you when you walk through the door, in the conversations that are finished and the ones that never will be. Ron Howard is still a master storyteller. But now he understands that the most important stories are not the ones he directs. They are the ones he chooses to be present for, the ones that unfold quietly, without applause, without control. And as the light finally dims, one truth lingers without resolution. After all the ambition, discipline, and mastery, what truly remains? And if life offered one more chance, would we reach harder for control or let go sooner and stay?